Hello, and as always, thank you for joining me. So I just saw on my Facebook news feed a sponsored ad, and I think it was called Labour Buzz. This was from the Labour Party, or presumably a grouping within the Labour Party, and it had a picture of Jeremy Corbyn. Um, Now it's very clear that the pitch they were making, this was from a Corbynite group. I really don't know the background, but um, there were people there, clearly supporters of Mr. Corbyn, saying that under Starmer, Labour is just Tory light. This is the sort of thinking that really it just seems very entrenched within the mindset of Jeremy Corbyn supporters. I mean, that should be an archaic term right now because Jeremy Corbyn's no longer leader. I mean, he hasn't been for over, what is it, about a month? Um, and when I consider this sort of logic, I mean, when you look at the sort of angle that Corbyn supporters take, everything's a conspiracy. So they lost the election because the nasty Murdoch media smeared their candidate. That's pretty much their theory. Well, I have a problem with that, A, because I don't think it's accurate, but B, because it's insulting to the wider public. It kind of insinuates that we're all idiots. That, oh, well, we just all read The Sun and thought Corbyn was a terrorist lover, so let's not vote for him. It doesn't occur to Corbyn supporters that people may have actually considered this. They may have actually had their own contentions with Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I've worked in journalism at least. I've got a background in journalism at university, and I'm doing a course now. So I wouldn't say that there's no influence from the media. Of course there is, and of course it was the case that right-wing tabloids were always anti-Corbyn from the start. But you know what? They were anti-Miliband as well. They were anti-Kinnock. They've been against most Labour leaders. So that is there, that bias is there. And some of it was very ad hominem. I saw certain cartoons in the Sun, for example, that had nothing to do with policy areas. They were just ad hominem attacks. Wasn't even good satire. But this reductionist argument that Corbynites make that everyone who disagrees with them or everyone who has an issue with Jeremy Corbyn must be some sort of right wing Tory, or as they so crudely put it, red Tories, that is, Labour people who didn't approve of Jeremy Corbyn, so oh, they must be Tories. In a way, it's like, and I've seen Corbyn supporters come out and say it's mainstream media bias. Who else has this sort of mentality? Trump supporters. That's the irony. You couldn't get two figures who are more politically on polar opposites as Jeremy Corbyn and Donald Trump, and yet both supporters, both sets of supporters, turn everything into a conspiracy against the mainstream media. Like every critique must be, oh, it's the Nazi mainstream media trying to make our person look bad. So what does this suggest? It suggests that if there is a bias in the mainstream media, then it's biased in favor of its interests. Because if they're biased against Trump and they're biased against Corbyn, and okay, I know it's two different countries we're talking about here, um, but I've frankly seen it from some Brexit supporters as well. That there's media bias against Brexit. They've often accused the BBC of that. The thing with the BBC, it's a big, big organisation, and I think there's many legitimate areas to criticise it on, but they can't please everyone. I mean, to conservatives, the BBC is a really lefty organisation. I personally think the bias is more to the left. But you ask a Corbynite about the BBC, they'll say it's a pro-government organisation, so they can't win. Um, and this is the problem with this sort of dogmatic thinking that you get from the hard right and the hard left. In the case of Corbyn supporters, it's a hard left. They just cannot comprehend that people may actually have legitimate contentions. So, for me, for instance, I really did not like Jeremy Corbyn's position on terrorist organisations. And this really phony argument is supporters make, oh, Jeremy's condemned all violence. No, that's not an answer. That's just a weak, evasive response. When someone is asked about a specific thing and they cannot give a specific answer, that is deflection. It's not good enough to say you condemn all violence if you're then going to home in on a particular kind of violence that you don't like. So, for example, when there is far right extremism, when Joe Cox was murdered, when there's been other examples of far right thuggery or violence, you can be sure that Jeremy Corbyn and others in his inner circle, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell, this isn't just about Corbyn, others on that faction of the Labour Party, they would be very, very specific in naming it. Yet when it's an Islamist attack, Corbyn's response was, "This is an awful incident, and we're thinking of the victims," and nothing wrong with that in itself. But it does say something about a refusal to talk about certain extremes. Not once when he was Labour leader did Jeremy Corbyn name Islamic extremism by name. Not once that I can think of. If someone could point to that, I'd be very happy to see it. He called Hezbollah our friends. But this isn't a right wing smear, this is a fact. And the excuses I've seen Corbynites make for that is, oh, it's just diplomatic. I'm sorry, but that is not diplomatic. Diplomatic would be, okay, let's speak to the Hezbollah representatives, see their point of view, something along those lines, which would still be controversial. But to say our friends, wake up, people. Another issue I had with Corbyn was I think that a lot of the positions he took, for example, human rights, were commendable, but there was a lack of consistency. When it came to Fidel Castro, a communist dictator who basically really, really crushed dissent in Cuba for decades, what was Corbyn's response? It was just blind adulation when he died in 2016. So I don't think Corbyn's consistent on human rights because those who make him out, oh, he's just a decent man who speaks out on human rights. Sometimes, yeah, but it's not consistent. And that's a problem if you're pontificating on that sort of thing. Um, Being from Northern Ireland, I have a big problem with Corbyn's attitude to the IRA. Again, not good enough to say just always generically condemning violence. The questions about the IRA were specific because the British people, particularly the people of Northern Ireland, but people on the mainland as well, have been terrorised by the IRA for years. That matters. The attitude to that matters from a prospective prime minister, especially when he claims to have been a peacenik. He met Sinn Féin representatives in the mid-80s as part of peace negotiations, but Corbyn was not a member of the Foreign Office. Corbyn wasn't even the shadow member of the Foreign Office, shadow Foreign Secretary or anything like that, so he really had no reason to do that. It all points to an ideological issue. And when it comes to ideology, Jeremy Corbyn has always, always, always been against this country. It's just a fact. That's not a right wing smear, it's a fact. Look it up. Just look at the man's record. So that's why I really have a problem with Corbynites who cannot get this idea out of their heads. But then again, they share the same worldview as he does. So of course they look up to him. Because like Jeremy Corbyn, they also share the sort of narrative that all this world's problems can be blamed on in America. And the British public rejected it. When it came to the Salisbury attack, what did Jeremy Corbyn do? He took a neutral position. He didn't come up outright and back Russia, but he may as well have, because in Parliament he basically regurgitated the sort of narrative that RT was spinning out. Oh, there's no evidence that this really happened. Corbyn's response was, oh, well, let's see the full story, let's see Russia's point of view. That is not the actions of a prime minister in waiting. Even if he wanted to be cautious, even if he wanted to say, well, let's get the full information, fine. But for goodness sake, don't play the devil's advocate for Putin's Kremlin. That this is what I find so distasteful about Jeremy Corbyn's record. And even now, when there is a new leader in the Labour Party, the Corbynites just can't get it. This is what really, really bugs me about their mentality. They hate the Tories, right? They think the Tories are terrible, they've caused so much suffering, etc., etc. So they want the Tories out of power, right? That won't happen for 4 years because that, with a fixed term parliament now, the next general election won't be until at least 2024. So if they really, really want the Tories out of power, then why are they making it so difficult, or why are they going out of the way to now be obstructionist to the new leader, to Keir Starmer? By saying things like he's Tory light or he's not really Labour. Because according to Corbynites, anyone who isn't Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell or Diane Abbott isn't true Labour. That's what's so toxic about their thinking. It's almost like they want Labour to stay in opposition. This is the strange paradox of the Labour Party that I really can't fathom. Tony Blair, the most electorally successful Labour leader ever, right? In terms of winning general elections, 3 general elections in a row. He's despised within the Labour left. Now, I appreciate he was a controversial and polarising figure. I certainly don't agree with everything he'd done. But I think it's a real indication of how these people think, that they would vilify the man who won Labour free general elections, and yet they adulate the man who lost two. Jeremy Corbyn lost 2 general elections, and they just can't get it into their heads. Everything's a big plot. I get it. Keir Starmer may not be your ideal choice. His positions may not be as radical to the left or the true Labour that you see it. But if you oppose him, if you're one of those people that, oh, I'm going to vote Green instead, it's your democratic right. But voting Green is a sure way to keep the Tories in power. Because the Greens, in my humble opinion, are not a party aspiring for government, they're just a big protest party. And I'm not just saying that because I dislike the policy positions. I don't think they actually have aspiration for government. I mean, for one thing, they don't have a uniform position on the union. How can a party that doesn't support the United Kingdom as a country, as a state, aspire for government? So the Green Party of England and Wales, do they want to be a devolved party if they can't support the United Kingdom? Makes no sense. So, and of course, the Green Party of Scotland is pro-independence. So what I'm driving at here is two things. Firstly, my critique of those on the left who just cannot fathom that their ideology will not get the Labour Party into power. And they cannot dismiss that all on right wing smears. They just can't. I mean, it's like they're digging and they're digging and they're digging, to get the gold or the treasure, whatever analogy you want to make. And they're digging deeper, and there's no gold or treasure there, but they've been digging deeper, and someone's shouting from the top, look, that shovel isn't working. And they're saying, yes, it is. Let's just keep going. They're too stubborn, and I would say a tad arrogant, to just not accept that it will not work. The reason Tony Blair won 3 general elections for Labour, the reason that government, by the way, put in the minimum wage, banned fox hunting, and a lot of other positive things, in my opinion, was because he went to the centre. Now, you could argue that Blair got too comfortable with the Murdoch press. I would say that's fair critique. But the reason we haven't had a Labour government in 10 years is because the party has went more to the left, not because it was somehow poisoned by Blair and Brown, but because it has went more to the left. So Starmer is not Tony Blair Mark II. I think he's more to the left than that. And I personally am waiting to see how Starmer performs. I'm not going to rush to judgment at this point. I think he'll be a lot better than Corbyn because of the reasons I've said. We'll never see Keir Starmer calling a terrorist organisation our friends. But and already he's made good moves. For example, regarding the anti-Semitism issue. But I'm not. I'll reserve my judgment until the. I don't think you could judge a leader after just 1 month. There's some things Starmer hasn't done that I'm not happy with. For example, the expulsion of Sir Trevor Phillips, I think that was a disgrace for no other reason than speaking out on the grooming gangs. He was expelled from the Labour Party for so-called Islamophobia, and Starmer hasn't done anything to sort of rehabilitate Trevor Phillips. And I know that the leader doesn't have the total say, but I think he could say something, and he hasn't done so. In fact, if anything, he spoke out against Sir Trevor Phillips being on the commission to look into why more people from ethnic minority backgrounds have died from coronavirus. Starmer, endorsed the lobby that doesn't want Sir Trevor Phillips to head that. So I'm not overly impressed by that. So I'm not going to come out and praise Starmer just yet. Time will tell. It may be that Starmer's a big disappointment. I just don't know. Time will tell. But he is definitely, definitely to the centre of Corbyn, and that can only be a good thing in my opinion. Um, so really, Corbynites, just if you really want to see the Tories out of power, for goodness sake, just swallow some humble pie and accept that your ideology will not work. I'm not telling you to give up your convictions, but if you really want the Tories out of power, just accept that the only way that'll happen is to get behind Sir Keir Starmer. It's the only way. It's a bit like Bernie supporters in the United States that actually voted for Trump in 2016 rather than voting for Hillary Clinton. Now, to me, that's bizarre. When they claim he's such a misogynist, such a racist, such a X, Y, and Z, they voted for him because they were so angry with the globalist Hillary Clinton. So what does this indicate? It indicates that the hard left and the hard right actually have more in common than they think. So my message to Corbynites is make your mind up. Do you want to support a centrist candidate who you don't entirely agree with, who isn't your ideal person, but who may actually have a chance of winning a general election? Or do you want to just cling on bitterly that your man lost, he had his chance twice, um, he lost. Do you want to just cling on to resentment about that and, abandon the Labour Party or try and just make things as difficult as possible for Sir Keir Starmer? I just don't understand their mentality. I don't understand their thinking. And it just indicates to me that they don't really aspire for government. So if you're a Corbyn supporter and you're thinking, oh, Starmer's not real Labour, what's your answer? What's your solution? Okay, you think the press is all corrupt. What's your solution? The only way that you get the Tories out of office is by backing Sir Keir Starmer. Then you might get some influence in the party, and who knows? Prime Minister Starmer might actually bring in some of your policies. But I think they're just too short-sighted to think that way. Anyway, that's just some kind of, it frustrates me, I have to say, because I don't like the Tory government. There's a lot of things I dislike about it, very much so. And as a centrist, like I said, I'm not going to fully endorse Starmer at this point. I think time will tell. But right now, Starmer's Labour is probably the best choice there is for centrists in the UK. It's not a wonderful choice. The Lib Dems have really, they're far less influential than they once were. And attempts at a new centrist party, just, the change.uk, that fizzled out in no time. So I actually think the British people don't like sudden radical change. I think we're quite conservative, socially speaking, in that sense. We're not a revolutionary country. So people need to be realistic. They need to work with what there is and work within that. Because we've tried revolution. The Corbyn attempts to have a revolution in this country just didn't work. The wider public rejected it. So wake up, people. I think the only way that we get rid of this Tory government, you want left wing policies brought in, the only way that happens is if you get a Labour Party in power. And right now, the leader is Sir Keir Starmer. May not be your ideal choice. But are you honestly saying you'd rather have a right wing Tory government than Keir Starmer? I can't comprehend that.